Hey everyone, welcome back to True Crime for Sleep Stories. Tonight's case is another quiet reminder that even the calmest places can hold dark secrets. If you're here to unwind, to relax, or to fall asleep while listening to real stories from the darker side of life, you're in the right place. So take a moment to get comfortable. And if you've been enjoying these peaceful true crime nights, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's dim the lights and begin tonight's story. My name is Charles Morrison, and I was a detective with the Columbia Police Department in South Carolina for 34 years, from 1972 to 2006. During that time, I worked hundreds of cases in the capital city and its surrounding areas, dealing with crimes ranging from burglaries to homicides. But in May 1975, I investigated the disappearance of a young college student that has haunted me for 49 years. A case where every lead evaporated and a bright young woman simply vanished while doing something as ordinary as going for a jog. Owens Field Park was a popular recreation area on the northeast side of Columbia, not far from the University of South Carolina campus. In 1975, it featured a mile-long jogging track that circled an open field, some picnic areas, and wooded sections along its edges. It was heavily used by students, families, and people from the surrounding neighborhoods. During daylight hours, it felt safe. Lots of people around, visible from the road, well-maintained. Darlene McGill was 21 years old in the spring of 1975, a junior at USC studying art with a focus on painting. She was from a small town called Newberry, about 40 miles northwest of Columbia, and lived in an apartment near campus with 2 roommates. Friends and professors described her as talented, hardworking, friendly, the kind of student who got involved, who people liked having around. Darlene was also a runner. She jogged regularly, usually in the late afternoon or early evening after her classes finished. Owens Field was one of her favorite spots. The track was exactly a mile long, making it easy to track her distance, and the area was generally safe and well populated. On Thursday, May 8, 1975, Darlene finished her classes around 4 p.m. She told her roommates she was going for a run at Owens Field, same as she did several times a week. She changed into running clothes, shorts, a t-shirt, running shoes, grabbed her portable cassette player with headphones. Sony Walkman-style devices were just becoming popular among joggers, and drove to the park in her car, a 1973 Volkswagen Beetle, yellow. That was around 5:30 p.m., according to her roommates. She'd said she'd be back by 7 o'clock or 7:30 for dinner. When she hadn't returned by 8 p.m. and wasn't answering the apartment phone, her roommate started to worry. By 9 p.m., they drove to Owens Field to check on her. They found Darlene's yellow Beetle in the parking area near the track, right where she would have parked. The car was locked, and sitting on the hood, visible in the glow of the parking lot lights, were her car keys. The roommates immediately knew something was wrong. Darlene wouldn't have left her keys on the hood. That made no sense. She would have locked them in the car or taken them with her. They called the Columbia Police Department around 9:30 p.m. I was on duty that evening and responded to the call along with several patrol officers. We arrived at Owens Field around 10 p.m. The park was mostly empty at that hour. A few late joggers, some people walking dogs, but nothing like the activity level during daylight. We examined Darlene's car. The keys were indeed sitting on the hood, positioned deliberately, not dropped or thrown there. Inside the locked car, we could see Darlene's purse on the passenger seat, containing her wallet, Idaho, and money. Her textbooks were in the back seat. Everything looked normal, except for the keys on the hood and the fact that Darlene was nowhere to be found. We began searching the park immediately, using flashlights, calling Darlene's name, checking the track, the wooded areas, the parking lots. We found no sign of her. Around midnight, we expanded the search to include the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the park and the neighborhoods bordering the area. Around 1 a.m., one of the patrol officers found something in the grass near the track, a single earbud, still attached to a wire that had been torn or pulled from the cassette player. The earbud was tangled in the grass about 50 yards from where Darlene's car was parked, suggesting she'd been running, wearing her headphones when something happened. We secured that as evidence and intensified the search. By dawn Friday morning, we had dozens of officers and volunteers searching Owens Field and the surrounding area. We used dogs to try to track Darlene's scent. The dogs picked up her scent from the car and followed it along the track for maybe 100 yards, then lost it completely. It was as if she'd vanished mid-stride. The investigation shifted to understanding what had happened. The keys on the hood suggested someone had taken them from Darlene, either by force or by finding them after she'd been abducted, and had returned to her car, possibly to check if there was anything valuable inside, then had left the keys on the hood for reasons we couldn't determine. The torn earbud suggested a sudden, violent encounter. Maybe Darlene had been grabbed while running, headphones ripped off in the struggle, or maybe she'd been startled, had pulled the headphones off herself, and they'd gotten tangled and torn. We interviewed everyone we could find who'd been at Owens Field Thursday evening. Several joggers remembered seeing Darlene, a young woman with long brown hair and a ponytail, wearing running clothes. One man, a regular runner at the park, said he'd seen her around 6 p.m., running on the track, wearing headphones. He'd noticed her because she'd waved at him as she passed. That was probably the last confirmed sighting. Another witness, a woman who'd been walking her dog, said she'd seen a brown sedan driving slowly through the parking area around 6:30 p.m., which had struck her as odd because the driver seemed to be watching the joggers rather than parking and getting out. She couldn't provide a detailed description, just a brown sedan, possibly a Chevy or Ford, late 1960s or early 1970s model. She hadn't seen the driver clearly or gotten a license plate number. We put out bulletins asking for anyone who'd been at Owens Field Thursday evening to come forward. We received several more calls from people who'd been there, but nobody had witnessed Darlene being abducted or had seen anything that clearly explained what happened to her. We investigated Darlene's background and personal life. Her roommates and friends were interviewed extensively. Darlene had been dating someone casually, a fellow art student, but the relationship was friendly, not serious, and he had an alibi for Thursday evening. He'd been in a studio class with multiple witnesses. Darlene had no known enemies, no conflicts, no reason anyone would want to harm her. She was well liked, focused on her studies, not involved in anything risky or dangerous. Her parents, Leonard and Mary McGill, drove to Columbia from Newberry as soon as they heard their daughter was missing. They were devastated and bewildered. Darlene called them every week, visited home frequently, seemed happy with her life at USC. They couldn't imagine why someone would target her or what had happened. The searches of Owens Field and surrounding areas continued for days. We dragged the creek, checked storm drains, searched wooded areas, and abandoned buildings within a several-mile radius. We checked with hospitals and morgues throughout South Carolina and neighboring states. We distributed Darlene's photograph and description to law enforcement agencies across the region. Nothing. No body, no additional evidence, no credible leads. Then, a week after Darlene disappeared, on May 15th, the Columbia Police Department received an anonymous phone call. A man, speaking quickly and nervously, said he'd been driving on Rosewood Drive, a major road about half a mile from Owens Field, on Thursday evening, May 8th, around 6:45 p.m. He'd seen a brown sedan pulled over on the shoulder. A young woman matching Darlene's description had been being forced into the car by a man. The woman had appeared to be struggling, and the man had been pushing her into the back seat. The caller said he'd been driving past and had only seen this for a few seconds, hadn't gotten a license plate number, hadn't thought much of it at the time, maybe assumed it was a domestic dispute or something. But after seeing the news coverage about Darlene McGill's disappearance, he realized what he'd witnessed might be connected. The dispatcher tried to keep him on the line, asked for his name and contact information so we could follow up. The man said he didn't want to get involved, that he was just calling to provide the information, and he hung up. The call had come from a payphone on the south side of Columbia. We sent officers to that location immediately, hoping to find the caller or witnesses who might have seen him use the phone. But we found nothing. That anonymous tip became a critical piece of the investigation. If accurate, it meant Darlene had been forcibly abducted from Owens Field, driven along Rosewood Drive, and put into a brown sedan, matching the description of the vehicle the dog walker had seen at the park. It gave us a timeline and a direction, but without knowing who the caller was or getting more details about the abduction or the vehicle, we couldn't pursue it effectively. We canvassed Rosewood Drive, asking residents if they'd seen a brown sedan pulled over Thursday evening around 6:45 p.m. We asked if any of them had witnessed anything suspicious. Nobody had. We checked traffic cameras. There were very few in Columbia in 1975, and none covered that particular stretch of Rosewood Drive. We investigated brown sedans. We checked registrations for brown Chevys and Fords in Richland County and surrounding areas. We found dozens of vehicles matching that general description. We interviewed owners, checked alibis, looked for any connection to Darlene or to Owens Field. Nothing conclusive emerged. The investigation looked at known sex offenders and violent criminals in the Columbia area. We found several individuals with concerning histories, interviewed them, checked their whereabouts. May 8th, none could be definitively connected to Darlene's disappearance. The case generated extensive media coverage. Darlene's photo was in newspapers throughout South Carolina. Her parents appeared on television pleading for information. The University of South Carolina held vigils and organized additional searches. Reward money was offered. Despite all of this attention, no significant breaks came. By summer 1975, the active search operations had ended. The case remained open as a missing persons investigation, but without new evidence or leads, there wasn't much to actively pursue. Darlene was listed with the National Missing Persons Registry, her information distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country. The mystery of what happened to Darlene McGill became one of Columbia's most troubling unsolved cases. Over the years, whenever remains were discovered in South Carolina or neighboring states, I'd check if they might be Darlene. None ever were. In the 1990s, DNA technology advanced enough that we could create a DNA profile from personal items belonging to Darlene that her family had preserved. The profile was entered into missing persons databases and compared against unidentified remains. No matches came back. I retired from the Columbia Police Department in 2006 after 34 years. Darlene's case remained one of several major unsolved cases for my career. I'm 83 years old now, living in Columbia still, and I think about her regularly. Over the 49 years since Darlene disappeared, I've developed a theory about what happened that May evening. I believe Darlene was running on the track at Owens Field, wearing her headphones, not particularly aware of her surroundings because of the music. Someone, probably the person in the brown sedan the dog walker had seen, had been watching joggers at the park, looking for an opportunity. He saw Darlene, identified her as a target, young, alone, distracted by her music. He waited for the right moment. When she was in a section of the track that wasn't as visible or was temporarily isolated from other joggers, he approached, grabbed her. The struggle was brief, the earbud torn from her headphones, maybe Darlene trying to fight back or scream, but being overpowered quickly. He forced her into his vehicle, possibly parked in an area adjacent to the track where cars could pull off without being in the main parking lot. He drove her away from Owens Field, heading down Rosewood Drive, where the anonymous caller saw the brown sedan with someone being forced into the back seat around 6:45 p.m. At some point, perhaps while Darlene was being held in the vehicle, the abductor took her car keys from her. Either she'd had them in a pocket or he went back to her car after securing her elsewhere. He returned to Owens Field, unlocked her car to check for valuables or anything useful, found nothing worth taking, and left her keys on the hood, possibly a taunt, possibly just carelessness. He then took Darlene somewhere remote, maybe to a house or property outside Columbia, maybe to a wooded area, maybe across state lines. He assaulted and killed her, then disposed of her body in a location it's never been found. The rural areas around Columbia in 1975 were vast, with forests, swamps, abandoned properties, countless places where remains could be hidden. The anonymous caller might have been someone who witnessed the abduction but didn't want to get involved for personal reasons. Maybe he had his own legal troubles and didn't want police attention. Maybe he was afraid of retaliation if he testified. Maybe he just didn't want the hassle of being a witness in a major case. His call provided crucial information, but without his testimony or additional details, we couldn't fully leverage what he'd seen. That theory fits the known evidence: the brown sedan, the torn earbud, the keys on the hood, the anonymous tip. It explains how Darlene could vanish so completely in a public park, but it's speculation. Without finding Darlene's remains, without identifying the man in the brown sedan, without the anonymous caller coming forward, I can't prove any of it. Darlene's family lived with the uncertainty for decades. Her parents, Leonard and Mary, never stopped looking. They contacted police regularly, followed up on tips, kept Darlene's case in the public eye. Leonard died in 2001, Mary in 2010, both without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. Darlene's younger brother, who was in high school when she disappeared, has continued advocating for the case. He's now in his 60s, living in Charleston, still hoping for answers. He's told me the not knowing is the hardest part, the inability to grieve properly, to have closure, to understand why his sister was taken. Owens Field Park still exists, though it's been renovated and expanded over the decades. The jogging track is still there, still used by runners from USC and the surrounding community. Most people using it today don't know that in May 1975, a young woman vanished from that very place, leaving behind only her keys and a torn earbud. The case remains officially open with the Columbia Police Department's Cold Case Unit. Darlene's DNA profile is in national databases. Her information is in missing persons systems. If her remains are ever found, we're ready to identify her. But after 49 years, the realistic chances of finding her are small. What I want people to understand is that Darlene McGill wasn't just a missing person or a cold case file. She was a talented art student with dreams of becoming a painter. She loved running, loved her family, was building a life at USC. She had friends who cared about her, professors who believed in her talent, a future that should have included graduation, a career, marriage, children, all the things a 21-year-old should have ahead of them. Instead, she went for a jog on a spring evening and never came home. Someone took her. Someone killed her. I'm certain of that. Nobody disappears this completely without foul play. And someone has lived with that secret for 49 years. I couldn't find Darlene. I couldn't identify her abductor. I couldn't give her family the answers and closure they desperately needed. That failure has stayed with me throughout my retirement and into my old age. But I can remember her. I can tell her story. I can insist that she mattered, that her disappearance wasn't just another unsolved case, but a tragedy that destroyed a family and left a community with unanswered questions. Darlene McGill disappeared from Owensfield Park on May 8, 1975. She's been missing for 49 years, but she's not forgotten. Her family remembers her. I remember her. And anyone who hears her story will know she was real, that her life had value, that she deserved so much better than what she got. That's all I can offer now. Memory, acknowledgement, and the hope that someday, somehow, Darlene will be found and her family will finally have the answers they've sought for nearly half a century. It's not justice, not closure, but it's something. And for a young woman who went running on a beautiful spring evening and never came home, maybe being remembered is at least a start. Darlene, wherever you are, you deserve better. Your family deserves answers. And you won't be forgotten. Not as long as there are people who believe that every missing person matters and every case deserves to be solved. Rest in peace. You mattered. You were real. And someday we'll bring you home. My name is Robert Duchenne, and I was a detective with the Rapides Parish Sheriff's Office in Louisiana for 36 years, from 1965 to 2001. In that time, I investigated every kind of crime you could imagine in central Louisiana. Bar fights that turned deadly, domestic murders, drug deals gone wrong, robberies. But in June 1971, I responded to a call at a rundown boarding house outside Alexandria that became one of the most puzzling double homicides I ever worked, a case that remains unsolved 53 years later. The Red River boarding house sat about 8 miles outside Alexandria proper, on a state highway that followed the Red River's path. It was a 2-story wooden structure built sometime in the 1930s, weathered and worn by decades of Louisiana heat and humidity. By 1971, it was the kind of place that catered to transients, construction workers passing through, people down on their luck, folks who needed a cheap room and didn't ask questions. The owner was a widow named Evelyn Thibodeau, probably in her 60s, who'd inherited the property from her husband and ran it by herself with occasional help from her nephew. It had maybe 10 rooms total, rarely all occupied, and brought in enough money to keep Evelyn surviving, but not much more. On June 18, 1971, a Friday morning around 10 a.m., Evelyn called the sheriff's office. She was upset, her voice shaking, said there was something wrong in room 7, that the smell coming from that room was terrible, and nobody was answering when she knocked. She'd used her master key to check and had immediately backed out and called us. I was working that day and took the call along with my partner, Detective James Morrison. We arrived at the boarding house around 10:30 a.m. Evelyn met us in the first floor common area, wringing her hands, clearly distressed. She explained that the 2 men in room 7 had checked in on Tuesday evening, June 15th. They'd paid cash for 3 nights, said they were in the area for construction work. She'd seen them only briefly when they checked in, and maybe once more on Wednesday morning. She hadn't seen them leave the room since Wednesday, but that wasn't particularly unusual. Guests came and went, kept their own schedules. But that morning, other guests had complained about a bad smell coming from the second floor, and when Evelyn went to investigate, the smell was strongest outside room 7. She'd knocked repeatedly with no answer, then used her master key. She'd opened the door just a few inches, seen what looked like someone lying on the floor, smelled the unmistakable odor of death, and immediately closed the door and called us. James and I went upstairs to the second floor. The smell hit us before we reached room 7. Death has a particular odor, sickly sweet and heavy, that you never forget once you've encountered it. We knocked on the door, announced ourselves, got no response. Using Evelyn's master key, we entered. The room was small. 2 twin beds, a dresser, a window overlooking the back of the property. 2 men were dead in the room. One was on the floor between the beds, lying face down. The other was on one of the beds, lying on his back. Both had been shot once in the head, entry wounds behind the ear, execution style. Both appeared to have been dead for at least a day, probably 2, based on the decomposition in the June heat. The room was otherwise undisturbed. The beds showed signs of having been slept in. A couple of duffel bags contained clothes and personal items, but there were no wallets, no identification, no money visible. The victim's pockets had been turned out, classic sign of robbery. We secured the scene and called for the coroner and crime scene investigators. While waiting for them, James and I checked the rest of the second floor. Room 6, directly across the hall from room 7, was empty but had clearly been occupied recently. The bed was unmade. There were toiletries in the bathroom, but the occupant and their belongings were gone. We went back downstairs and questioned Evelyn. She pulled out her guest register, a simple ledger where she recorded names and dates. Room 7 had been rented to John Smith and Tom Jones, obviously fake names, who checked in Tuesday, June 15th around 8 p.m. They'd paid $30 cash for 3 nights. Room 6 had been occupied by a man who'd registered as David Brown, another common fake name. He'd checked in on Monday, June 14th, also paying cash. Evelyn's description of him was vague. White male, maybe 30s or 40s. Average height, brown hair, nothing distinctive. He'd kept to himself, hadn't caused any problems. Evelyn said she'd last seen the man from room 6 on Thursday morning, June 17th. He'd been carrying a small bag and had told her he was checking out a day early. Something had come up. She'd returned his unused deposit and he'd left. That was around 9 a.m. Thursday, probably around the time the men in room 7 had already been dead for 12 to 24 hours. The timing was suspicious. The occupant of room 6 had left suddenly one day early, right around when his across-the-hall neighbors had been murdered, and he'd vanished completely. Fake name, cash payment, no trail. The coroner, Dr. Helen Chen, arrived around noon and conducted preliminary examinations. Both victims were young men, probably mid-20s, killed by .22 caliber gunshots to the head. The wounds suggested close range, possibly while they were sleeping or incapacitated. Time of death was estimated at Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning, probably within hours of them checking in. Crime scene investigators processed room 7 thoroughly. They found the spent .22 bullets, badly damaged from passing through bone and brain tissue. They collected fingerprints from surfaces throughout the room, doorknobs, dresser, bathroom, most of which presumably belonged to the victims, but some could belong to the killer. They also processed the stairwell and hallway. That's where they found the bloody handprint on the wall of the stairwell between the first and second floors, about chest height, as if someone had steadied themselves while going up or down the stairs. The print was photographed and lifted for analysis. It appeared to be a left hand, adult male based on size. The victim's belongings were searched carefully. In the duffel bags were work clothes, boots, basic toiletries, nothing unusual for construction workers, but there was no identification, no papers, no wallets or money. Either they'd been traveling without ID, unlikely, or the killer had taken it. The investigation focused on identifying the victims and finding the man from room 6. Fingerprints from both victims were sent to state and federal databases. Within a day, we got matches. The victims were identified as Marcus LeBlanc, 23, and his cousin Raymond LeBlanc, 25, both from Shreveport, Louisiana. We contacted the Shreveport Police Department, who sent officers to notify the LeBlanc family. Marcus and Raymond were cousins who'd grown up together. Both worked in construction. Both had been traveling to Alexandria for a job that was supposed to start that week. Their family had filed missing persons reports on Thursday, June 17th, when Marcus and Raymond hadn't shown up for the job and hadn't called. The family was devastated. Marcus's mother and Raymond's parents came to Alexandria to identify the bodies officially and to help with the investigation. They told us Marcus and Raymond were good kids, hardworking, no criminal history, no known enemies. They'd left Shreveport on Tuesday morning, June 15th, driving together in Marcus's truck, a 1968 Ford F-100 Blue, headed to Alexandria for construction work. The truck was never found. We put out bulletins for it, checked with Louisiana State Police and neighboring states, but Marcus's truck had vanished along with their wallets and identification. The investigation turned to finding the man from room 6. We showed Evelyn composite sketches based on her vague description, hoping she could provide more details. She did her best, but the resulting sketch was generic. Could have been thousands of men in Louisiana. We interviewed other guests at the boarding house, asking if they'd seen or heard anything Tuesday night or Wednesday morning. Nobody reported hearing gunshots. .22 caliber shots are relatively quiet, and with the boarding house's old construction and spacing between rooms, it's plausible nobody heard anything. One guest, a man who'd been staying in room 9 at the end of the hall, mentioned he'd heard footsteps in the hallway late Tuesday night, maybe around midnight or 1 a.m. He'd assumed it was just other guests coming back from somewhere. He hadn't looked out to see who it was. Another guest, a woman in room 3 on the first floor, mentioned she'd seen a man leaving the boarding house early Thursday morning. maybe around 8:30 or 9 a.m., carrying a bag, walking toward the road. Her description matched the man from room 6 generally, but she hadn't paid much attention and couldn't provide useful details. We checked the bloody handprint against fingerprints collected from room 6 and from known criminals in our databases. The print was too smudged to make a definitive match to specific individuals, but it was consistent with the palm and finger size we'd expect from an adult male. The theory that developed was straightforward. The man in room 6 had somehow learned that Marcus and Raymond had money, had waited until they were asleep or vulnerable, had entered room 7 and shot them both execution style, had taken their wallets and truck keys, and had left in their truck Thursday morning, abandoning his own vehicle or having never had one. But that theory had problems. How did the man in room 6 know Marcus and Raymond had money worth stealing? Had he observed them, overheard them talking? Had there been some interaction Tuesday night that we didn't know about? And why leave the bloody handprint in the stairwell? Had he been injured during the crime, or was it blood transfer from the victims? We investigated further. We checked with the local construction companies, asking if anyone matching the description of the man from room 6 had applied for work or been seen around job sites. We checked bars and restaurants in Alexandria, asking if anyone remembered seeing 3 men matching the descriptions of the victims and the suspect together. We found no credible leads. We searched for Marcus's truck throughout Louisiana and neighboring states. We checked used car lots, chop shops, any place a stolen truck might be sold or stripped. The truck was never located. It had simply vanished, presumably repainted or dismantled for parts by someone who knew how to make vehicles disappear. The case generated local media attention. Double murder at boarding house. Construction workers killed in Alexandria. Police seek suspect in Red River murders. The composite sketch of the man from room 6 was published in newspapers and shown on television. We got tips, but nothing that led to a solid suspect or identification. By the end of summer 1971, the active investigation had stalled. We'd exhausted our obvious leads, interviewed everyone connected to the boarding house, followed up on every tip. Marcus and Raymond LeBlanc were buried in Shreveport, their funerals attended by large extended families who demanded justice we couldn't provide. The case remained open as an active double homicide investigation. Over the years, I'd periodically review the file, check new information against the case, hope for a break. In the 1990s, DNA technology advanced enough that we could test biological evidence. The bloody handprint was re-examined, but the DNA extracted was degraded and incomplete, not sufficient for definitive matching. I retired from the Rapides Parish Sheriff's Office in 2001 after 36 years. The Red River boarding house murders remained one of my major unsolved cases. I'm 84 years old now, living in Alexandria still, and I think about Marcus and Raymond LeBlanc regularly. Over the 53 years since they were killed, I've remained convinced that the man who registered as David Brown in room 6 was their killer. The timing of his departure, the proximity of his room, the fake name, the cash payment, everything points to him. He checked in the day before Marcus and Raymond, positioned himself across the hall, waited for his opportunity, killed them while they slept, took what he could, wallets, identification, truck keys, and left the next morning in their truck. He was probably a career criminal, someone who'd done this before, who knew how to travel using fake names and cash, who knew how to make vehicles disappear. who knew how to avoid leaving evidence. The .22 caliber execution style shots suggest experience with violence. The lack of witnesses and the clean getaway suggest planning and discipline. I believe he's probably dead now, having lived out his life without facing consequences for what he did. Or maybe he was caught for other crimes and died in prison without anyone connecting him to the Alexandria murders. Either way, Marcus and Raymond never got justice. Their families lived with the pain of that injustice. Marcus's mother died in the 1990s without seeing her son's killer caught. Raymond's parents both passed away in the 2000s with the same burden. The cousins, siblings, and other relatives carry the memory of two young men who went to Alexandria for honest work and ended up murdered in a cheap boarding house. The Red River boarding house itself is long gone. It was torn down in the early 1990s after years of decline and eventual abandonment. The property is now just an empty lot, overgrown with vegetation, a reminder of what once stood there and what happened in Room 7 in June 1971. The case remains officially open with the Rapids Parish Sheriff's Office. The evidence is preserved, DNA profiles are in databases, and if any new information emerges, investigators will follow up. But after 53 years, the realistic chances of solving the case are minimal. What I want people to understand is that Marcus and Raymond weren't just victims or case numbers. They were real young men with families who loved them, with futures ahead of them. Marcus wanted to save enough money to buy a house and settle down. Raymond was engaged to be married. The wedding was supposed to be that fall. They were hard-working, decent guys who'd done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They deserved to work that construction job, to earn their money, to go home to Shreveport and their families. They deserved to live full lives. Instead, they were killed for whatever cash they had in their wallets in a truck, murdered by someone who saw them as nothing more than targets. I couldn't give them or their families justice. I couldn't identify the killer definitively, couldn't bring him to trial, couldn't provide the closure that comes from a conviction. That failure has stayed with me for 53 years, but I can remember Marcus and Raymond. I can tell their story. I can insist that they mattered, that their deaths deserve to be acknowledged, that they're more than just a cold case file in a sheriff's department archive. Marcus LeBlanc and Raymond LeBlanc were murdered in a boarding house outside Alexandria in June 1971. Their killer was never caught, but they're not forgotten. Their families remember them. I remember them. And anyone who hears their story will know they were real, that their lives had value, that they deserved so much better than what they got. That's all I can offer now. Memory, acknowledgement, and the refusal to let them be forgotten. It's not justice, not closure, but it's something. And for two young men who went looking for work and found death instead, maybe being remembered is at least a start. Marcus and Raymond, wherever you are, you deserve better. I'm sorry we couldn't give you justice, but you're not forgotten. You never will be. The Red River runs through Louisiana, carrying water and history and secrets. The boarding house that stood on its banks is gone, but the memory of what happened there remains, and it will remain until the day truth finally surfaces and justice, however delayed, is finally served. Rest in peace. You mattered. You were real, and you won't be forgotten. On a humid afternoon in July 1979, construction workers Tony Vaccaro and Dennis O'Brien were breaking up the concrete floor in the basement of a 3-story brick row house at 247 Chestnut Hill Avenue in Brighton, Massachusetts. The building, constructed in the 1920s, was being gutted and renovated by a developer who planned to convert it into condominiums, part of the gradual gentrification beginning to transform the working-class neighborhood. The basement had been divided into a small apartment decades earlier, and that section had apparently been sealed off sometime in the past. The concrete floor was thicker than expected, and when Vaccaro's jackhammer finally broke through, he noticed something that made him shut off the tool immediately. In the cavity beneath the concrete was what appeared to be a human skull. The Boston Police Department was called, and within hours, detectives and forensic investigators from the Massachusetts State Police were carefully excavating the site. What they found was a complete skeleton, lying in what appeared to be a deliberately dug shallow grave, then covered with concrete. The remains were transported to the office of the Chief Medical Examiner, where forensic anthropologist Dr. Eleanor Hartwell conducted a detailed examination. Her findings painted a picture of who the victim might have been. The skeleton was that of a female, approximately 25, 30 years old at the time of death. She had been about 4 inches tall, with a slight build. Her teeth showed evidence of dental work, fillings consistent with mid-20th century dentistry. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, no broken bones, no bullet holes in the skull, no marks that would indicate stabbing or blunt force trauma. The absence of obvious injury didn't rule out murder, however. Strangulation, suffocation, poisoning, or other methods that don't leave skeletal evidence could have been the cause of death. After more than a decade underground, soft tissue evidence was completely gone. Based on the condition of the bones and the concrete above them, Dr. Hartwell estimated the woman had been buried sometime in the mid-1960s, possibly as early as 1964 or as late as 1967. The concrete had the composition and weathering pattern consistent with that era. Found with the remains were several items that had survived underground. Fragments of fabric that appeared to be from a uniform, light blue polyester with white piping, a style common for waitresses and food service workers in the 1960s. An old-fashioned metal lighter, tarnished but with visible engraving, the initials JL. Remnants of what might have been a simple dress or slip beneath the uniform. A single earring, costume jewelry with a small blue stone. Fragments of leather that were likely from shoes. No identification, no jewelry with names, nothing that could immediately tell investigators who she was. Detective Lieutenant James Donovan of the Boston Police Homicide Unit took the lead on what was now a murder investigation. Even without a clear cause of death, the circumstances made it obvious this was not a natural death or accident. Someone had buried a woman's body and covered it with concrete. The first challenge was identifying the victim. Donovan's team began by researching the history of the property at 247 Chestnut Hill Avenue. Property records showed the building had changed hands several times since the 1960s. In 1966, it was owned by Harold and Doris Kemp, an elderly couple who lived on the second floor and rented out the other units. Harold Kemp had died in 1968, and Doris had sold the property in 1970 to a family named Sullivan. The Sullivans sold it in 1976 to the current developer. The Brighton neighborhood in the 1960s had been a densely populated working-class area, home to many Irish and Italian immigrant families, students from nearby Boston College, and young working people. The area had high residential turnover, with people frequently moving in and out of rental units. Investigators located Doris Kemp, now 78, and living in a nursing home in Quincy. Her memory was spotty, but when shown photographs of the building and asked about tenants in the mid-1960s, one memory surfaced clearly. There was a couple in the basement, she told Detective Donovan. A young couple. They kept to themselves, didn't cause any trouble. I remember the landlord, my husband Harold. He was happy because they paid rent on time. Then one day they were just gone. Doris couldn't remember their names with certainty. She thought it might have been Collins or Colton, something like that. She remembered the man more clearly than the woman. He was tall, dark-haired, and worked in construction or some kind of manual labor. The woman was quiet, small, and Doris thought she might have worked at a restaurant or diner because she sometimes saw her coming home in what looked like a work uniform. When did they leave? Donovan asked. It was sudden, Doris said. Must have been 1966, maybe early 67. They didn't give notice or anything, just disappeared, left some furniture behind. Harold was angry about it. They owed maybe half a month's rent, but then he figured, well, the furniture was worth something, so he let it go. Did you report them missing? Doris looked confused. Missing? No. People moved all the time. We thought they just skipped out on the rent. It happened now and then in those days. This was the key lead, but it was frustratingly vague. A couple named something like Collins or Colton, living in the basement in 1966, who left suddenly without notice. Detective Donovan's team began the painstaking work of searching through records from the 1960s. This was 1979, before computerized databases, so everything involved physical files, archived newspapers, and manual cross-referencing. They searched missing persons reports filed in Boston between 1964 and 1968. Several women in their 20s were reported missing during that period, but none of the descriptions matched well enough to be promising. Most of those missing women were later found, had been runaways who eventually returned, or had simply moved without telling their families. They checked death certificates and coroner's reports. Perhaps the woman had died naturally and the boyfriend had panicked and buried her rather than reporting it. But no unidentified female deaths of the right age matched the time frame. Social Security records were requested for women who had stopped working in the Boston area in 1965 to 1967, but this approach yielded thousands of potential names. Women who had gotten married, moved, retired, or simply stopped working for various reasons. Without a name to focus on, this data was overwhelming. The waitress uniform fragment was a clue, but Boston had hundreds of diners, restaurants, and cafeterias in the 1960s. Many had closed or changed hands multiple times since then. Investigators contacted restaurant associations and placed notices in local papers asking former restaurant owners or managers from the 1960s to come forward if they remembered an employee who had disappeared. But the responses were either irrelevant or dead ends. The lighter engraved with JL seemed promising. Perhaps those were the victim's initials or the initials of someone significant to her. But without more information, it was just two letters that could stand for thousands of different names. Detectives went door to door in Brighton, interviewing longtime residents who might remember something from the 1960s. This produced scattered memories, but nothing definitive. A woman who had lived 2 streets over remembered a young couple who kept weird hours, but couldn't remember names or exact location. An elderly man recalled that one of the basement apartments on Chestnut Hill Avenue had been sealed up sometime in the late 60s, but he'd assumed it was because of water damage or foundation problems. Several people remembered Harold Kemp as a gruff landlord who didn't maintain properties well, but no one suggested he was violent or criminal. One promising lead came from a retired postal worker who had delivered mail to that route in the 1960s. He vaguely remembered a situation where mail had piled up for a basement apartment, and when he'd inquired, he was told the tenants had moved, but he couldn't remember the name on the mail or the exact address. It had been more than a decade ago, and he'd delivered to hundreds of addresses. By early 1980, the investigation had stalled. Despite months of work, Detective Donovan and his team had been unable to definitively identify the victim, locate the couple who had rented the basement apartment, find any missing persons report that matched the circumstances, develop any suspects beyond the vague couple who had lived there. The case was given a name, Brighton Jane Doe, and a file number. It remained open, but without active leads to pursue, investigative resources were redirected to current cases. The remains were held in the medical examiner's office. Dental records were kept on file in case any matching records ever surfaced. The evidence, the fabric, the lighter, the earring, was carefully preserved and cataloged. In the late 1990s, with the advent of DNA technology, there was renewed hope for cold cases. The Brighton Jane Doe case was re-examined to see if DNA could be extracted from the skeletal remains. Unfortunately, the results were disappointing. While some degraded DNA was recovered from bone marrow, the quality was insufficient for the kind of detailed analysis needed to make identifications through family matching, a technique that wouldn't become sophisticated enough for cold cases until the 2000s anyway. In 2008, the case was reviewed again as part of a cold case initiative. A forensic artist created a facial reconstruction based on the skull, and this image was publicized in Boston media with appeals for information. Several tips came in from people who thought the reconstruction resembled someone they had known, but none of these leads panned out. The women identified were all still alive or had died under known circumstances that didn't match. Based on the evidence and investigation, retired Detective Donovan, interviewed in 2015, laid out what he believed was the most likely sequence of events. A young woman, probably a waitress at some local restaurant, was living with a boyfriend in that basement apartment in 1966 or so. Something happened. Maybe a domestic dispute that got out of hand. Maybe something else. The boyfriend killed her, probably in a way that didn't involve obvious trauma. Strangulation or suffocation would be my guess. He panicked. He couldn't exactly call the police and say his girlfriend died accidentally. There would be too many questions, especially if they had a history of fighting or if he had a criminal record. So he buried her right there in the basement, dug up part of the floor, laid her body in the ground, and covered it back up with concrete. Then he cleaned up the apartment, told the landlord they were moving, and disappeared. In those days, it wasn't hard to vanish. No computerized tracking, no surveillance cameras, no internet. Change your name, move to another city or another state, get paid in cash, and you're effectively gone. The landlord, Harold Kemp, probably sealed off that section of the basement later, maybe because of cracks in the concrete, maybe because of dampness or foundation issues. He had no idea what was under there, or if he did suspect something, he wasn't going to report it and get involved in a murder investigation. That generation, especially landlords, they didn't want trouble with police The boyfriend is probably dead by now. It's been over 50 years. Maybe he lived with the guilt his whole life. Maybe he didn't. We'll probably never know who he was, and we'll probably never know who she was either, which is the real tragedy. In 2018, with the explosion of genetic genealogy techniques used to solve cold cases, most famously the Golden State Killer case, the Brighton Jane Doe case was resubmitted for advanced DNA analysis. New techniques allowed researchers to extract more usable DNA from the preserved bone samples. A partial DNA profile was developed and uploaded to genealogical databases. However, as of 2024, no matches have been found. This suggests either that the victim's family members haven't uploaded their DNA to these databases, or that she doesn't have close enough relatives in the databases to generate a match with the partial profile available. The case received renewed publicity in 2022 when a true crime podcast featured it. This generated some new tips, but none proved to be the breakthrough investigators hoped for. The Brighton Jane Doe case remains open with the Boston Police Department. The file is periodically reviewed, and investigators remain hopeful that advancing technology or a chance discovery might someday provide answers. The skeletal remains were eventually buried in a marked grave at Forest Hills Cemetery in Jamaica Plain in 2010. After it became clear that keeping them indefinitely in storage served no investigative purpose, the grave marker reads, "Unknown woman, found 1979, not forgotten." The building at 247 Chestnut Hill Avenue still stands, now divided into condominiums. Current residents are usually unaware of its history unless they happen to research it. The basement where the body was found is now part of a ground floor unit, completely renovated with no trace of the past. The Brighton Jane Doe case represents a frustrating reality of cold case investigation. Sometimes there simply isn't enough information to solve a crime, no matter how much time and effort is invested. She was likely a young working-class woman in 1960s Boston, perhaps an immigrant or the child of immigrants, perhaps someone estranged from her family, perhaps someone who had moved to the city for work and didn't have deep roots in the community. When she disappeared, no one filed a missing persons report, which suggests either that she had no close family, or that her family didn't know where she was, or that they assumed she had simply moved on as young people often did. Her killer was probably someone close to her. Statistically, most women who are murdered are killed by intimate partners. He likely covered up the crime successfully because in the 1960s, forensic science was primitive by today's standards. Record keeping was less comprehensive, and a young working-class woman without powerful connections could disappear without triggering an intensive investigation. What we know about Brighton Jane Doe is limited but human. She was young, probably in her mid to late 20s. She worked, probably as a waitress, serving food to people in some long-gone Boston diner. Someone at some point gave her, or she bought a lighter engraved with the initials JL. Perhaps those were her initials. Perhaps they belonged to someone she loved. She wore a single blue earring, costume jewelry, nothing expensive. She lived in a basement apartment in Brighton in the mid-1960s during a time when the neighborhood was full of working people trying to make ends meet, when the Vietnam War was escalating, when the country was changing rapidly. And then one day, in 1966 or 1967, her life ended, and someone buried her beneath concrete, and she was forgotten. Until 1979, when construction workers broke through that concrete and brought her story back into the light, even if her name remains unknown. The case will likely never be fully solved. The people who knew her are probably dead. The man who likely killed her is almost certainly dead. The restaurants where she might have worked are long closed. The Boston of the 1960s exists now only in photographs and memories, but she is not entirely forgotten. Her case remains open. Her remains lie in a marked grave, and periodically, investigators review her file, hoping that somehow, someday, they might give her back her name and give someone, somewhere, the answer to what happened to their daughter, their sister, their friend who disappeared so long ago. That's not the dramatic resolution that makes for satisfying storytelling, but it's the honest reality of many cold cases. Not a mystery solved, but a life acknowledged, a crime remembered, and a commitment to keep trying, however small the chances, to find the truth. On Friday, April 15, 1983, Bill Dunbar, 54, and Earl Haskins, 48, stopped at the Chevron station in Beatty, Nevada, around 3:30 in the afternoon. The attendant, a young man named Travis Coleman, remembered them clearly because they were in good spirits, joking about striking it rich and buying the whole town a round of drinks when they came back with their gold. Dunbar and Haskins were weekend prospectors, part of a small community of hobbyists who spent their free time exploring the old mining country around Nye County. Both men had day jobs. Dunbar was a mechanic in Tonopah, and Haskins worked for the county roads department, but their real passion was searching for overlooked gold deposits and the countless abandoned claims that dotted the Nevada desert. They filled up Dunbar's 1978 Ford F-250, loaded with camping gear, metal detectors, picks, shovels, and enough food and water for a 3-day trip. Coleman recalled that they had several 5-gallon water jugs, which was sensible for April in the desert when temperatures could still climb into the 90s during the day. The men told Coleman they were heading to the Calico Ridge area, about 40 miles northeast of Beatty, rugged, remote country that had seen some small-scale mining in the late 1800s but had been largely abandoned for decades. They planned to be back by Monday evening at the latest. Haskins had to work on Tuesday, and Dunbar was expecting a parts delivery for his shop. That casual conversation at the gas station was the last confirmed sighting of both men alive. When neither man showed up for work on Tuesday, April 19th, their families weren't immediately concerned. Desert prospecting sometimes ran long. A promising find might keep them an extra day, or vehicle trouble could delay their return. But by Wednesday, when neither man had called and both remained unreachable, cell phones weren't common in 1983. Their wives contacted the Nye County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff's deputies knew both men by reputation. They were experienced desert rats, not greenhorns who would panic at the first sign of trouble. Dunbar had been prospecting in Nevada for over 20 years, and Haskins, though newer to the hobby, was a capable outdoorsman who hunted and fished regularly. If they were overdue, something had gone wrong. A search was organized for Thursday morning, April 21st. Sheriff's deputies, along with volunteers from the local prospecting club and off-road vehicle enthusiasts familiar with the area, headed into the Calico Ridge region. The area was vast, hundreds of square miles of desert, rocky hills, old mine shafts, and dry washes. Without knowing their exact location, searchers faced a daunting task. On Friday afternoon, April 22nd, a search team found what appeared to be Dunbar and Haskins' campsite in a small canyon about 8 miles from the nearest dirt road. The discovery was both a relief they had found something and deeply unsettling. The camp had clearly been abandoned in a hurry, or possibly worse. The tent was partially collapsed and showed signs of fire damage along one side, though the fire appeared to have gone out or been extinguished before consuming the entire structure. Supplies were scattered across the area: canned food, cooking equipment, sleeping bags pulled from the tent and left in the dirt. Their metal detectors and prospecting tools were still at the site, which struck investigators as odd. If the men had left voluntarily, why wouldn't they have taken their equipment? The gear represented several $100s of investment, not something experienced prospectors would simply abandon. Most disturbing was what searchers described as a trail of disturbed sand leading from the campsite toward a dry gulch about 100 yards away. The sand showed drag marks and scuff patterns, as if something or someone had been pulled or had struggled while moving in that direction. However, the desert wind and the passage of several days had degraded whatever tracks might have been there, making it impossible to determine exactly what had created the disturbance. Deputies secured the scene and called in investigators from the Nevada Division of Investigation. The scattered camp, the partial fire, and the strange trail all suggested something had gone badly wrong. Forensic examination of the campsite revealed some details but raised more questions. The fire damage to the tent appeared to have started from outside, not inside, a pattern inconsistent with an accidental cooking fire or knocked-over lantern. The fabric showed scorch marks and melting consistent with an accelerant, though investigators couldn't determine what might have been used. No blood was found at the campsite. This was both reassuring and puzzling. If violence had occurred, there should have been some trace evidence. The absence of blood suggested that whatever happened hadn't involved serious injury at the campsite itself, or that the scene had been cleaned, which seemed unlikely given the remote location. Personal items were inventoried, wallets with cash and identification still inside, watches, a camera with undeveloped film, and perhaps most tellingly, a holstered .357 revolver that belonged to Dunbar. He always carried it for snake protection. The fact that the gun remained at camp suggested that whatever emergency arose happened either when Dunbar wasn't wearing it, or so suddenly that he had no time to grab it. The food supplies were examined. Some canned goods were missing, and one of the water jugs was gone, but several full jugs remained. If the men had left voluntarily due to some emergency, they likely would have taken more water, the desert's most precious resource. On May 3rd, 1983, nearly 3 weeks after the men disappeared, a rancher checking on his cattle in an area 30 miles southwest of the campsite and in the opposite direction from Beatty spotted a blue Ford pickup partially hidden behind an outcropping of rock off a rarely used Jeep trail. It was Dunbar's truck. The keys were in the ignition, turned to the accessory position, which had drained the battery dead. The driver's door was open. Earl Haskins's distinctive leather cowboy hat, one his wife immediately identified, lay on the ground next to the driver's side door. The truck's fuel gauge showed empty, though investigators couldn't determine if it had run out of gas naturally or if the tank had been deliberately drained. The mileage was consistent with a drive from the campsite area to this location, though the odometer didn't provide definitive proof of the route taken. Inside the truck, investigators found nothing unusual. No signs of struggle, No blood, no notes or messages. The bench seat showed dirt and dust consistent with desert use. In the truck bed, they found a single 5-gallon water jug nearly empty and a canvas tarp. The location where the truck was found puzzled investigators. It was in a remote area, but not one known for prospecting or mining. The Jeep trail led eventually back toward Highway 95, but it was a long, rough route that someone unfamiliar with the area would be unlikely to take. Why would the men have driven here? And if they had, where had they gone after the truck ran out of gas? The discovery of the truck prompted a massive search of the surrounding area. Search and rescue teams, tracking dogs, and aerial surveys covered dozens of square miles around both the campsite and the truck location. They searched the dry gulch where the disturbed sand led, old mine shafts in the region, and the entire corridor between the camp and where the truck was found. The heat was now becoming a factor. By mid-May, daytime temperatures in the desert were climbing above 100 degrees. If the men were injured and stranded somewhere, their chances of survival diminished with each passing day. The Nevada desert is unforgiving to those without water and shelter. Despite the intensive efforts, no trace of either man was found. No bodies, no additional evidence, no signs of recent human presence in the vast search area. It was as if they had simply vanished after reaching the truck's final location. Investigators and search coordinators developed several theories about what might have happened. One possibility was that something had frightened or disturbed the men at their campsite, possibly the fire starting accidentally or through natural causes, and they had fled in panic. In the confusion and darkness, assuming this happened at night, they might have become disoriented, taken the truck in the wrong direction, run out of gas, and then attempted to walk out, succumbing to exposure somewhere in the vast desert. However, this theory had problems. Both men were experienced and knew the desert. Even in an emergency, they would have known to stay with the truck rather than attempt to walk out in unfamiliar territory. The truck's cargo bed contained signaling equipment they could have used, and their behavior at the gas station suggested they were well prepared and in good spirits, not the type to panic. The partial burning of the tent, the scattered camp, and the disturbed sand all suggested the possibility of violence. Perhaps they had encountered other people, claim jumpers, criminals hiding in the desert, or someone with a grudge who attacked them. But this theory also had issues. Nothing of value appeared to have been stolen. Their cash, identification, even the valuable prospecting equipment remained at camp. There was no evidence of recent mining activity in the area that might have made someone protective of a claim. And who would attack two men in such a remote location, then go to the effort of moving their truck 30 miles away? The Nevada Division of Investigation ran background checks on both men. Neither had enemies, gambling debts, criminal connections, or any reason someone would target them. Both were well liked in their communities, stable family men with no hidden problems that investigators could find. Some theorized that the men might have fallen into an old mine shaft. The Calico Ridge area was riddled with abandoned mines from the 1800s, many poorly marked or completely hidden. If one or both had fallen into a shaft, the other might have attempted a rescue, leading to both being trapped. Search teams carefully checked every known mine shaft within a 10-mile radius of the campsite and the truck location. Some shafts were rappelled into by experienced rescue personnel. No sign of the men was found. However, investigators acknowledged that there could be unmarked shafts they didn't know about, or shafts that had collapsed sealing off any evidence. Nevada's desert is home to mountain lions, though attacks on adult humans are rare. Some speculated that an animal encounter might have scattered the camp and led to the men fleeing. However, there was no evidence of animal activity at the campsite. No tracks, no scat, no partially consumed food that would suggest wildlife had been present. Through the summer of 1983, the Nye County Sheriff's Office continued to work the case. They re-interviewed witnesses, checked leads called in by the public, and coordinated with agencies across Nevada in case the men had somehow made it to another area. The undeveloped film from the camera found at camp was processed. It showed pictures from their prospecting trip, images of the desert landscape, the men posing with their equipment, their campsite in the early stages of being set up. The photos were taken Friday evening and Saturday morning, suggesting whatever happened occurred Saturday evening or night. Nothing in the photographs seemed unusual or ominous. By fall, with no new evidence or leads, the active investigation began to wind down. Both men were declared legally dead in 1984, though the manner of death was listed as undetermined. Their families held memorial services without bodies to bury. The case officially remained open, as all unsolved missing persons cases do, but without leads to pursue, investigative resources were directed elsewhere. In 1991, an off-road motorcyclist exploring a remote canyon about 15 miles from where the truck was found discovered what appeared to be human remains, a partial skeleton weathered by years of desert exposure. The Nye County Sheriff's Office recovered the remains and sent them for forensic analysis. The remains were those of an adult male, but that was about all that could be determined with certainty. The bones had been scattered by animals and the elements. No identification, clothing, or personal effects were found with the remains. DNA testing in 1991 was still in its relative infancy and expensive, but the families of Dunbar and Haskins requested it be performed. The results were inconclusive. The DNA quality from the degraded bone samples wasn't sufficient to make a definitive match to either man. The remains could have been Dunbar or Haskins, or they could have been someone else entirely. The desert held the bones of many people who had died over the decades: prospectors, migrants, drifters, and others who had met their end in that harsh environment. The remains were eventually buried in a Tonopah cemetery under a marker reading "Unknown Man, found 1991. Some family members believe it was Bill or Earl. Others aren't convinced. In 2003, when GPS technology and digital mapping had advanced significantly, a volunteer search group used satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to search for unmarked mine shafts in the Calico Ridge area. They identified 17 previously unknown shafts. A team explored those that were safely accessible, but found no evidence related to the missing men. After reviewing all available evidence and conducting interviews with the original investigators, the most probable explanation involves a combination of factors. The men likely encountered an emergency at their campsite Saturday night, possibly the tent catching fire from a lantern or cooking accident. In the confusion and darkness, perhaps with smoke and flames, they grabbed what they could, loaded into the truck, and left quickly, which would explain the scattered camp and abandoned equipment. In the dark, possibly with one or both men suffering from smoke inhalation or minor burns, they took a wrong turn on the confusing network of dirt roads and jeep trails that crisscross that region. GPS didn't exist for civilian use, and map reading at night in featureless desert terrain is challenging even for experienced outdoorsmen. They drove until the truck ran out of gas, either because they started with less fuel than they thought, or because the panicked driving consumed fuel quickly, or both. At that point, likely now Sunday or even Monday, they faced a critical decision. Standard desert survival advice is to stay with your vehicle. It's visible from the air, provides shelter, and searching parties will find it eventually. But if the men believed they were only a few miles from a highway or help, a common mistake in the desert where distances are deceptive, they might have decided to walk out. April nights in the Nevada desert can still drop to near freezing, while daytime temperatures exceed 90 degrees. Without adequate water, a person can die of exposure in as little as 24 hours in those conditions. If Dunbar and Haskins walked away from the truck in the wrong direction, became lost in the maze of canyons and hills, they likely succumbed to dehydration and exposure within a day or two. Their bodies could be anywhere in hundreds of square miles of desert, potentially in a wash that floods occasionally. Even in the desert, flash floods occur, buried under shifting sand, concealed in a crevice, or simply weathered to the point of being unrecognizable as human remains from any distance. The partial remains found in 1991 could well have been one of them, but forensic science at the time couldn't prove it definitively. Bill Dunbar and Earl Haskins are remembered by the prospecting community as cautionary tales of how quickly things can go wrong in the desert, even for experienced people. Their story has been recounted in prospecting clubs and outdoor groups as a reminder of the importance of telling people your exact plans and expected return time, carrying more water than you think you'll need, staying with your vehicle in an emergency, carrying reliable communication equipment, something that would become much easier with cell phones and satellite communicators in later decades. Never underestimating the desert, no matter how experienced you are. Their families eventually found some peace, though the lack of definitive answers remained painful. Both wives eventually moved away from Tonopah, seeking fresh starts in places without constant reminders. The Calico Ridge area still attracts prospectors, though it's less popular now than it was in the 1980s. Most of the weekend prospectors who go there know the story of Dunbar and Haskins and take extra precautions because of it. The Nye County Sheriff's Office has no active investigation into the disappearance, though the case remains technically open. The current sheriff, interviewed in 2022, stated that while the case is sad and frustrating, he believes the men died of exposure somewhere in the desert after their truck ran out of gas, and that their remains simply haven't been located in the vast search area. The desert doesn't give up its dead easily, he said. We have people who disappear out there, and sometimes they're never found. The sand shifts, the animals scatter things. The sun and wind break everything down. Those men could be out there 50 feet from a hiking trail, and you'd walk right past and never know. It's not the dramatic or satisfying conclusion that families or true crime enthusiasts might hope for. No villain, no mystery that can be definitively solved, no justice to be served. Just two men who went into an unforgiving environment, encountered an emergency, made what they thought were the right decisions, and paid the ultimate price for what was likely a series of small, understandable mistakes compounded by bad luck. The desert keeps its secrets, and sometimes the only answer is that there is no answer, just a reminder of nature's indifference and the thin margin between life and death in one of Earth's harshest environments. cold morning of February 14, 1988, Valentine's Day, a neighbor discovered the body of 47-year-old Barbara Thompson in her modest home on Leatherwood Creek Road in Shadyside, Ohio. The divorced mother of two had been strangled with what appeared to be a length of cord or rope. What made investigators take particular notice was the knot, an unusual, distinctive pattern that suggested either specialized knowledge or a personal signature. Shadyside, a small Ohio river town of fewer than 4,000 residents in Belmont County, was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors. The murder of Barbara Thompson shattered that sense of security, but many residents initially treated it as an isolated tragedy, perhaps a domestic dispute or personal conflict gone wrong. The Belmont County Sheriff's Office began their investigation by looking at Thompson's personal life. She worked at a local diner and was known as friendly but private. Investigators found no signs of forced entry, suggesting she may have known her attacker or at least opened the door willingly. There was no evidence of sexual assault, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. The motive was unclear. On June 22, 1988, just over 4 months later, 52-year-old Linda Reese was found dead in her home on Main Street in Shadyside, less than a mile from where Barbara Thompson had lived. She too had been strangled, and investigators immediately noted the similar method, a ligature with that same distinctive knot pattern. Reese, like Thompson, was a middle-aged woman living alone. She worked as a clerk at a local hardware store. Again, there was no forced entry, no sexual assault, no robbery. The crime scene suggested the killer had been calm and methodical. Neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual, hearing no screams or sounds of struggle. Now the small community was genuinely frightened. Two women killed in the same manner in the same small town within months of each other. This was clearly the work of a serial killer. The local newspaper, the Times Leader, ran headlines warning residents to lock their doors and be cautious about strangers. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and chain locks. The sheriff's office, recognizing they were dealing with something beyond their usual scope, requested assistance from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. Profilers suggested they were looking for someone local, someone who knew the area well and possibly knew the victims. The lack of forced entry in both cases indicated the women may have felt comfortable opening their doors to this person. On October 8, 1988, 49-year-old Carol Jennings was found strangled in her home on Pike Street, again within the same small radius of Shadyside. The signature knot was present once more. Like the previous victims, Jennings was a middle-aged woman living alone, worked a service job. She was a beautician, and there was no evidence of forced entry, sexual assault, or theft. The pattern was now undeniable, and panic gripped the town. Women, especially those living alone, were terrified. Gun sales spiked. People who had lived their entire lives in Shadyside without locking their doors now installed multiple locks and security systems. Some women temporarily moved in with relatives or friends, unwilling to sleep alone in their homes. Local churches held prayer vigils. The sheriff's office set up a hotline for tips and held community meetings to discuss safety. State police increased patrols in the area. The FBI profile suggested a white male, likely between 25 and 45, someone who worked a blue-collar job that gave him freedom of movement during daytime hours, someone organized and methodical, possibly someone with military or mechanical experience given the distinctive knot. Investigators began focusing on Donald Ray Miller, a 34-year-old handyman who lived in Shadyside and had done work for all three victims at various times in the years preceding their deaths. He drove a van, worked independently, and was known to many residents as someone reliable for odd jobs and repairs. Miller had access to the victims' homes. He had repaired a leaking faucet for Barbara Thompson, done some electrical work for Linda Reese, and installed new shelving for Carol Jennings. He knew their routines, their living situations, and they would have opened their doors to him without hesitation. The circumstantial case seemed strong: opportunity, access, and knowledge of all three victims. Several residents reported that Miller drove past certain houses frequently, seemingly without purpose. One neighbor claimed to have seen his van near Carol Jennings' house on the day of her murder, though the timing wasn't certain. Miller was brought in for questioning multiple times. He was cooperative but maintained his innocence. He acknowledged having worked for all three women, but said he had done jobs for dozens of people in Shadyside. It was a small town, and he was one of the few reliable handymen available. He provided alibis for the times of the murders. He had been working at various job sites, though not all of these could be fully verified, since he often worked alone. Under pressure from investigators and intense public scrutiny, Miller agreed to take 2 separate polygraph examinations. Both times, the results indicated he was being truthful when he denied involvement in the murders. Polygraph results aren't admissible in court and aren't foolproof, but they gave investigators pause. Meanwhile, forensic evidence from the crime scenes was limited. This was 1988, before DNA testing was widely available for criminal investigations. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, no physical evidence definitively linking any suspect to the crimes. The distinctive knot, while unusual, couldn't be traced to any specific profession or organization. Investigators consulted with the Navy, Boy Scouts, and various trades, but the knot didn't match any standard pattern they were familiar with. It appeared to be a variation or personal creation. A search warrant executed on Miller's home and vehicle turned up nothing incriminating. No ropes or cords matching those used in the murders. No trophies or mementos from the victims. No suspicious documentation. His background check revealed no violent criminal history, no history of sexual offenses, nothing that would predict this kind of behavior. In November 1988, just weeks after the third murder, Donald Ray Miller moved away from Shadyside. He told people he was leaving because of the suspicion and harassment. Though he had never been formally charged, everyone in town knew he was the prime suspect, and his handyman business had dried up completely. He relocated to Columbus, Ohio, where he had family. After Miller left, the murders stopped. No more women were found strangled in Shadyside. This fact, more than any evidence, convinced many locals that Miller had been the killer. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidental. However, investigators noted that the murders stopping could also be explained by other factors. The killer had become too afraid of being caught, given the intense scrutiny, or had died, or moved away for unrelated reasons. In 1991, 3 years after the Shadyside murders, FBI analysts reviewing unsolved strangulation cases noticed similarities between the Ohio crimes and 2 unsolved murders in Wheeling, West Virginia, just across the Ohio River, about 15 miles from Shadyside. In 1985 and 1987, 2 women in Wheeling had been found strangled in their homes. Both were middle-aged women living alone. While the cases hadn't initially been connected to each other or to the Shadyside murders, a review of crime scene photographs revealed that the ligature knots appeared remarkably similar to those used in Shadyside. This discovery suggested the possibility that the killer had been active before 1988 and had a broader geographic range than initially thought. It also complicated the case against Donald Ray Miller, as he had been living in Shadyside during the West Virginia murders and had no known connections to Wheeling. If the same person killed all 5 women, the killer would have needed access and opportunity across state lines. Investigators looked into whether Miller had any reason to be in Wheeling during the times of those murders, but they found no evidence he had been there. Other potential suspects were reviewed: truck drivers, traveling salesmen, or others whose work took them between Ohio and West Virginia, but no strong leads emerged. Through the 1990s, the Belmont County Sheriff's Office periodically revisited the case, especially when new forensic technologies became available. In the late 1990s, when DNA analysis became more sophisticated and accessible, evidence from the crime scenes was retested. Unfortunately, no usable DNA from the perpetrator was recovered from any of the 3 Shadyside victims. The killer had been careful or simply lucky. Investigators interviewed Donald Ray Miller again in 1996, but he continued to deny involvement and declined to take another polygraph. By this point, he had rebuilt his life in Columbus, had remarried, and was working in construction. Without new evidence, there was no basis to charge him. The case files remained open, but active investigation wound down as leads were exhausted and investigators retired or moved on to other cases. The Shadyside murders joined the ranks of unsolved cases that departments maintain but lack the resources or leads to actively pursue. In 2015, the case was reviewed again as part of a statewide initiative to apply modern forensic techniques to cold cases. By this time, Donald Ray Miller had died in 2008, taking with him any secrets he might have had. DNA testing with more sensitive techniques was attempted on remaining evidence, but the results were inconclusive. After nearly 30 years, the biological material had degraded significantly. Investigators also used modern geographic profiling techniques to analyze the pattern of crimes. The analysis supported what investigators had long suspected. The killer was likely someone based in or very near Shadyside, someone familiar with the community and the victims' routines. The clustering of all 3 murders within a 2-mile radius and the apparent comfort level between victims and killer suggested a local perpetrator. The review team also took another look at the West Virginia cases. While the knot similarity was real, other aspects of those crimes were different enough that investigators couldn't definitively say they were committed by the same person. It was possible they were related, but it was equally possible that the knot similarity was coincidental, or that multiple offenders had learned the same knot from a common source. As of 2025, the Shadyside murders remain officially unsolved. The case files are maintained by the Belmont County Sheriff's Office, and the department's official position is that the investigation remains open pending new evidence or information. In practical terms, most investigators familiar with the case believe Donald Ray Miller was likely responsible based on the circumstantial evidence and the cessation of murders after his departure. However, likely responsible and provable beyond a reasonable doubt are 2 different standards, and the latter was never achieved. Without physical evidence or witness testimony directly linking him to the crimes, prosecutors could never have brought charges even when Miller was alive. Other investigators remain less certain. Some point out that Miller's cooperation, his willingness to take polygraphs, and the lack of any physical evidence, despite multiple searches, suggest he may have been an innocent man whose only crime was being a convenient suspect. They note that serial killers rarely stop killing voluntarily unless incarcerated, seriously injured, or dead. And Miller lived another 20 years after leaving Shadyside without any similar crimes being attributed to him. Shadyside today is even smaller than it was in 1988, with a population that has declined to around 3,500. The murders are still discussed, particularly by older residents who remember the fear that gripped the community that year. The 3 victims are buried in local cemeteries. Barbara Thompson's children, now in their 50s, still live in the area. They've spoken occasionally to local reporters, expressing frustration that their mother's killer was never brought to justice, but also resigned acceptance that they may never know for certain what happened or who was responsible. The case has been featured in a few true crime books and podcasts focused on Appalachian cold cases, but it has never received the national attention of more sensational crimes. Perhaps because it occurred in such a small, out-of-the-way place, or because it lacks the dramatic elements of some serial killer cases, it remains largely known only to those with a specific interest in Ohio cold cases. For law enforcement, the Shadyside case represents both the limitations of 1980s forensic science and the frustration of circumstantial cases. Every investigator who worked the case believed they knew who the killer was, but knowing and proving are different things. The case helped push the Belmont County Sheriff's Office to invest in better evidence collection and preservation practices, recognizing that future technologies might be able to extract information that 1980s techniques couldn't. For the community, the murders left a permanent mark. Shadyside never fully regained its sense of innocent security. Even today, residents are more likely to lock their doors, more cautious about strangers, more aware that violence can come to even the smallest, quietest communities. The most likely conclusion, based on the totality of evidence and circumstances, is that Donald Ray Miller was indeed the Shadyside Strangler. The coincidence of his connection to all 3 victims, combined with the immediate cessation of murders upon his departure, forms a compelling circumstantial case. Yet the possibility remains, however slim, that the real killer was someone else entirely, someone who either stopped killing for their own reasons or who was never on investigators' radar at all. What is certain is that 3 women lost their lives in a terrifying series of murders that went unsolved. Their families never received the justice of seeing someone convicted for these crimes. And a small town learned that the security they had taken for granted was more fragile than they had ever imagined. The case remains a reminder that not every mystery gets solved, not every criminal gets caught, and sometimes the closest we come to answers is an educated guess based on circumstantial evidence and the strange timing of when the murder stopped.